Thank you for the opportunity to talk today. So this year I have been a 2024 Nuffield Australia Scholar. Nuffield Farming Scholarships are awarded to people involved in agriculture and primary production around the world. So there's 15 countries globally that are engaged in Nuffield Farming Scholarships. I was awarded one in September last year, so I've spent the last 12 months travelling around the world. It's a global experiential leadership program, and so travelling around the world, trying to understand how agriculture works in other countries, bringing some of that learning back to Australia to try and hopefully impart it on the people around me. Part of a Nuffield Scholarship is also around choosing a topic to study. So part of your travel is doing personal research on a study topic, which is why I'm standing here today. And I also will publish a report next year on my study topic. So my study topic is around, is tracking carbon good for business? So I'm a farmer. I've got a farm with my husband up near Gundawindi on the Queensland border. I also work with Local Land Services in Extension. So yeah, I was really curious, confused, sceptical, overwhelmed, and I figured that surely somewhere around the world someone had figured this out. I'm not really sure that they have, is an early takeaway. But I also wanted to know who is supporting farmers. So around the world, how are farmers engaging and what are they doing? This year I've been to 11 countries, and what I found is that people are engaging either through carbon markets. So we've just heard from Suze about the ACCU scheme in Australia, and overseas people are engaging in similar programs, or they're measuring, monitoring and managing their carbon footprints on farm for productivity and profitability. The other thing is the countries I've visited and the examples I'm going to give, they're not the best, they're not the worst. I wanted to get an idea of what was happening in countries that I thought were similar to Australia, but also very, very different from Australia. So hopefully the examples I'm giving are ones of farmers who are working on the ground and the things that they're doing. So, as I mentioned, like we've talked about the ACCU scheme, the ACCU scheme in Australia is quite unique. I expected originally to go to all these other countries and they'd have exactly the same thing happening. Turns out they don't. So the fact that we've got such a science-based, rigorous scheme or project, scheme sounds a bit dodgy, but project or program in Australia is pretty good. So in the USA, for example, I visited some graziers. They had undertaken soil carbon projects with a global program called Vera. So that's it's the biggest global carbon program in the world, and it's probably one of the better known ones. So they had been supported by a not-for-profit organisation and a carbon service provider to enter into high density, high rotation, long rest grazing programs, and they were supported through water and wire essentially. So for them, it made sense. They were able to improve the way that they grazed their grass, so they had more grass growing, more ground cover. What did Sue say? Ground cover is queen. And they also had an alternative income stream. So for them, it made sense. I also visited Matador Ranch and Cattle in Montana, which is a huge 380,000 acre property that is all grazing. I think 12,000 breeders they have on farm. They had also in 2023, July 2023, so nearly 18 months ago, entered into 2 soil carbon projects with another well-known international provider. They also were doing high rotation, high density, long rest grazing, and so for them obviously an alternative income stream, better grass growth, able to turn cattle off earlier, because if you're growing more grass you're feeding your cows more grass. So for them it made sense. The other thing that they did, which was interesting, is they did heaps of soil tests. So they were able to choose the sites which would benefit the most from a carbon project. So we talk about knowing your data and doing the soil tests like Macca talked about before, and this is another example where that was used. And it was interesting talking to farmers. They were definitely like, yeah, if we're doing the right thing, we should be rewarded for this. It was, interesting interesting place to visit. I headed to Alberta. So the reason I originally was going to Canada was because Alberta had one of the first carbon markets in the world. They started theirs in 2009. In Alberta, I'm sure a few of you have been, the landscape is just studded with oil and gas rigs all over the place. So to offset those oil and gas rigs, this carbon market was born for agriculture. From talking to farmers involved in it, some benefited, but not everyone. There were some junk credits that were sold, which weren't necessarily backed by the best science and probably didn't have a lot of integrity. However, that scheme is still going and they are improving. And I think the thing we have to keep in mind with this carbon stuff is it's progress over perfection. We're not going to get it right 100% straight away, but at least we're progressing and we're learning from our mistakes. So Alberta was an interesting one. I headed to the UK as well. Not many carbon projects in the UK. There is a bit of scepticism with the farmers I spoke to in the UK. They only have a couple of codes locally, the UK, the Peatland Restoration Code and the Woodland Code. And in the UK, as you know, in a lot of parts of the world, subsidies exist. So in the UK, there's a program called the Sustainable Farming Incentives Scheme. And for farmers to be able to be involved in that scheme by having buffer strips or by improving hedgerows or doing soil management plans, which they can get paid a per hectare price for, it's a lot easier than going into a carbon market. So someone said to me, well, why would we do a carbon project when we can do the sustainable farming incentives? I also headed to Vietnam. I actually was in Vietnam with Suze Orgel. She was the team leader of the project that I was going to learn about. I have to say, I've never had any exposure to rice paddies or rice farmers, but I think at the end of the day, we're all farmers and we're all trying to do the same thing, which is make a living from the land, but do it in a way that means that we can keep on doing that into the future. Interestingly, the Vietnamese government wants to connect to global voluntary carbon markets by 2028. However, in Vietnam, carbon markets are brand new. I went to a carbon forum with a whole lot of Department of Agriculture staff, and carbon markets are a very, very new space for them. So they've got thousands of questions, which in my eyes sort of sees that they're also open to some less scrupulous organisations coming in and taking advantage of farmers there. So the Australian researchers were working with some university researchers over there to develop a project called Carbon in Focus. And the team leader of this project is in the room, so I'd better make sure I get this info right. It is about getting informed and science-led carbon market research out there that benefits farmers. So it's making sure that they can make the right decisions, and if they get involved in carbon markets, that they are doing it for the right reasons and that they will benefit from that. So it was almost sort of taking a step back from where we are and looking at it from the eyes of someone who it's a brand new concept and it's really developing in that part of the world. And it was in the Mekong Delta, which is really susceptible to climate change and impacts from climate. And I think for me, it's like obviously that education and that capacity building is really key to making sure that when carbon markets are up and running in Vietnam, that they're done properly and they're done well. And I think the Australian team that I was with and the Vietnamese guys are doing an amazing job at sort of getting that started. As I said, the first thing people were getting involved with were carbon markets. The second thing that they were doing was measuring and managing carbon footprints on farm. So in Canada, the federal government has a program called the On-Farm Climate Action Fund. They have 700 million Canadian dollars over 3 years that was invested in that project, where farmers could apply to do 3 things on farm, apply for funding. That either was around rotational grazing, nitrous oxide management, so managing your fertilisers and your how you apply those, and the third one was cover cropping. So as a farmer, you could apply to an organisation and receive up to 85% of the funding of that program to cover the cost. So it was water and wire, it was putting cover crops in. So for farmers who did that, I met a Alberta organic grain farmer. He put a cover crop in under that program. On Prince Edward Island, all the way over the other side of the country, a beef farmer who got water and wire to be able to split their paddocks up and put troughs in, and so they were able to manage their ground cover better. Comes back to that, ground cover is queen, it lifts your soil organic matter, it grows more grass, you're putting more cattle on in a cattle instance, and in cover cropping it just means you've got the roots in the ground and the green grass, the green plants growing more throughout the year. So for those farmers it made sense because they could prioritise actions that actually led to improved productivity and efficiencies on farm. And I also visited Perry Farms, which is a regenerative potato farmer in southern Alberta. They have a fairly big business. They have potatoes that they supply to McCain. They also have rotations with canola and a few other crops as well. So they do quite extensive soil testing. They have solar panels on farm which help reduce their Scope 2 emissions. They have to report to McCain using the Cool Farm tool. Can I say, has anyone ever heard of the Cool Farm tool? A few hands. It's a European-based carbon calculator similar to the ones we use in Australia, like the MLA carbon calculator or the AIA tool, the newer one. But it is for the European context. It's mandatory for him to report his emissions and calculations to McCain. He doesn't get a price premium yet, but he thinks it'll actually be about market access. So it'll be the people who are providing the better numbers will get preference over those who don't. That's not there yet, but that's where he sees it going. Interestingly, I also visited a potato farmer who supplies to McCain in Poland. They aren't required yet to report their emissions to McCain, but McCain are talking about it. So these are the big businesses that are sort of coming down the supply chain saying, we need to know your numbers. But with that, like with them knowing their numbers and them knowing their soil carbon and their organic matter, they are able to make decisions that then benefit their business. So if they do their soil tests, they've worked out they don't need to use synthetic fertilisers every single year. Some years they don't use them at all, or some years they use biologicals instead. And that actually saves them money, but as well as doing that, it reduces their emissions, because if you're not using fert, that's a big saving in what your emissions are on farm. So the UK was an interesting visit. I had a discussion with a consultant who was employed by a couple of companies. One of them is called Arla, which is a Danish organic dairy company, and the other one was called Dawn Dumbia, which is a meat processor. The consultant was paid by those companies to work with some, not all, but some of their producers to measure their carbon footprint. So it was only like, I think 1,000 of their dairies and 500 of their farmers, beef farmers, that they were recording the carbon footprint of. However, they then were able to work with the farmers when they'd done that and look at some of the gaps in that data to see where are the efficiencies. So if you're a beef producer and you're looking at all the information that goes into the carbon calculator, you can work out, well, how can I make efficiencies? Is that in our feed? Is it in our productivity? How can we do better? And so the consultant is then able to work with those producers to help them make improvements. And Dawn Dumbia were the first beef company to do this in the UK, and they did have a competitive advantage over their other customers purely because they could provide carbon footprints of some of their clients to their suppliers. I visited a couple of farmers, a dairy farmer in Dorset who'd been collecting carbon data for 6 years. They got 2 pence per litre as a premium for doing that, but it wasn't just carbon, it was also sort of a whole lot of sustainability stuff. and they supplied to ALA, and ALA provided them with a platform to do that. But because they did that, they got a premium, and because they did that, they had 6 years' worth of data, so they could compare year on year where they were sitting, where they could make improvements, and what they could do better. And probably also where they were already doing really well, they could see that too. And I met and spoke to a beef and sheep farmer in Scotland who had been collecting data for 10 years. So in 2014, she started collecting carbon data on farm under an industry initiative or an industry program that their farm was involved in. She then continued doing it because she thought it was useful to have the data. Similarly to the dairy farmer, helps you make good decisions when you know where you're at and you can compare year on year. She then was involved in another government initiative that if they could provide their data, they got, I guess you'd call it incentives, back for doing that. And she said, when I spoke to her most recently, that I think it was as of 2026, all farmers in Scotland are required to provide their carbon data to the government. It's a government requirement. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen here anytime soon, but it's what's happening in other parts of the world. So really interesting takeaway. And going back to Matador Ranch in the USA, when it comes to measuring and monitoring, they were obviously quite involved through the carbon project, so that was a really big thing for them. But like I said, they were doing all this extra above and beyond the requirements with the soil carbon testing, so they could work out where would they get the most bang for their buck for their soil carbon project, and then could make really good decisions on how they could manage their farm with that information. They also did an Asparagopsis trial. It was a very small scale. It was, I think, one of the first grazing trials of Asparagopsis in the world. They said they got I haven't got my notes in front of me, but I'm going to say a 30% increase in production. They said there were no side benefits to, impacts of that. But we know that Asparagopsis as a feed additive is an expensive option. So Claire talked about trade-offs before. Everything we do does have a trade-off. So for me, my thinking is that what's the trade-off of doing Asparagopsis? Is it costly? Is it even an option in grazing systems? But they did it, they had a go, and I think they found the data really useful. And someone said to me, it was the Scottish beef farmer. I said, well, because she's quite sceptical of the whole, like, having to provide the carbon data all the time and why it's required. And I said, well, why do you keep doing it? She said, well, you can't throw stones from the outside. You've got to understand the system to be able to engage and provide constructive criticism to the organisations or the government that you're engaging with, which I thought was a really clever thing to do. And Uruguay. I went to Uruguay, I was in Brazil, so I thought, well, I'll just pop over to Uruguay while I'm here. Uruguay has no net zero targets. There are 145 countries in the world that either have or are considering net zero targets. Uruguay isn't one of them. Beef is their second largest export commodity behind forestry. Beef is a huge part of their culture. So they have a Ministry of Livestock. They don't have a Ministry of Agriculture, they have a Ministry of Livestock, so it tells you something. But they obviously, if we're talking about reducing emissions in countries like Uruguay, which are relatively poor, it's a big struggle for them. They have issues with set stocking, overgrazing and productivity, so that preg testing isn't the norm. They're not culling empty cows. They join heifers quite late. They turn off animals quite late. So the opportunities for them, when I spoke with their industry body, is that they could look at improving ground cover through rotational grazing, so you've got more grass, more ground cover, and also by doing things like preg testing, by turning off cattle earlier, by improving your feed efficiency, all those sorts of things. I also visited a carbon neutral beef farm. They sell Angus beef. They sell 10% of their Angus beef at a premium to Switzerland. All the rest of the beef goes to China. They were the second carbon neutral certified farm in Uruguay. and they do it by high rotation, high density, long rest grazing, but they also have quite a lot of forestry and vegetation on farm, which is, I guess, a bit of a sink for them. So it was, really interesting to be on the other side of the world and actually feel like you were in the New England, actually, over in Uruguay. And Vietnam, again, they do have net zero by 2050, same as us, which you think of a country like Vietnam, which is tiny, and there's a huge population of people where the farms are an average of 1 hectare in size, and they've got the same targets as us. It's a bit mind-blowing. But obviously the government has plans. I mean, and in Vietnam, rice paddies are the biggest emitters, so that's why the Australians are over there, I guess, working with the universities to try and find ways forward for the Vietnamese people and Vietnamese farmers. And they also have a national government policy of 1 million hectares of low emissions sustainable rice. That's a lot of 1 hectare farms to get low emission sustainable rice on. But just to give you a snapshot of what is happening in other parts of the world that are very different from Australia, I thought it was worth including. So I'm coming towards the end of my Nuffield travels and my research. I still think I'm quite, there's a lot of information there. It's very confusing still. I discover one new thing and then find there's 10 other rabbit holes I could go down and understand. But for me, it's really embedded the fact that this is a global issue. It's not going anywhere. As I said, 145 countries have net zero or are considering net zero targets. We talked about the Paris Agreement earlier. I think just under 200 countries around the world have signed up to the Paris Agreement, which is reducing global warming by 1.5 degrees. So to think that we don't need to do anything it's not an option. And like I said, I think Australia's doing a pretty good job. We have compared to the rest of the world, our ACCU scheme is really rigorous and has a lot more integrity than other parts of other schemes and programs around the world. We have days like today, for example, where there's opportunities to learn, I think, and so I think take the opportunities to learn, take the opportunities to ask questions, because the more you know now, the easier it's going to be in the long run. Progress over perfection. It doesn't need to be 100%. Doesn't have to be like your neighbour. You just have to have a go. Even if you got home and you found a calculator, you logged in and you started putting numbers in. That's a really, really good place to start. And a thing I've found, whether it's through a carbon market or whether it's looking at your carbon footprint, if you're reducing emissions or you're storing carbon, then you are able to increase productivity and increase efficiencies on farm. Yesterday, one of the speakers who couldn't be here today said, don't make bad business decisions for carbon that's 100%. You can't do that because otherwise you go out the back door. But you can look at what are the easy things you can do on farm around productivity and that can improve your efficiencies that actually also improve your sequestration or reduce emissions. And be informed to make the decisions that suit your farm. Everyone's situation is different, everyone's risk appetite is different, everyone's motivation is different. So just know your business, know your priorities and ask questions. And I think that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Pip.